Hello, puppies and kittens. Another episode of Matter of Fact Science, which I'm really enjoying, wherein we talk to professional scientists and just hear what it is that they do, why it matters to them and to everyone else. And today, I have a professor at the university that I'm currently attending. Where am I? I am one class away from Bachelor of Science in Anthropology. And one of the professors there gave a lecture, and I very much appreciated it. This is William Kimbel, who is the director of the Institute for Human Origins at Arizona State University. He's a paleoanthropologist who has worked on many of the same digs as Donald Johanson on many of the famous finds. And from here on, I will let Mr. Kimbel, Professor Kimbel, take it over. Sir, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Well, thank you, Aaron, first of all, for having me. This is a rare treat for me to be able to be on a public broadcast like this on the internet and potentially be able to talk about what I do and why I think it's important to a large number of viewers. So thanks for the opportunity. So as you mentioned, I'm a paleoanthropologist. And what does a paleoanthropologist do? Well, I, like many of my colleagues, are intrigued by the so-called hard evidence for our origins and evolution. And that evidence includes the fossil record going back millions of years, as well as the records of ancient cultures beginning at around 3 million years ago and going to the present in the form of artifacts made by populations that were either relatives or ancestral to us. So I work in Africa, principally in Ethiopia now for about 30 years. At the site where Lucy was found. In fact, I began my career as an undergraduate student in Ohio, where I worked with Lucy's discoverer, you mentioned, Dr. Donald Johanson, back in the 1970s. And so I've been doing this for a long time, worked in Africa for a long time. I've made some good discoveries, great discoveries, important discoveries that help document the emergence of our lineage from an ancestor we shared, according to the evidence of DNA, with the chimpanzee about 6 or 7 million years ago. And what the evidence that we have accumulated has suggested is that there is a long record of evolutionary change from an ape-like creature to a more human-like creature over that 6 or 7 million year period since the common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees.
What date did you say? 8 million or 6 million?
For
the gap between humans and chimpanzees.
The last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans is thought to have lived about 6 or 7 million years ago.
Okay, 6 or 7 would be more in line with what I'd heard. Okay, I just want to make sure I hadn't misheard you. So in the lecture that you gave for our virtual class meeting, you went through extensive lines of physical evidence, not just DNA, but I mean, there was quite a lot of physical evidence too for the transition from the stereotypical concept of the ape being a chimpanzee or a gorilla, I guess homoine or hominine. Yeah, and so I'd like, if you wouldn't, I mean, we wouldn't mind. I'd like to hear some more about that.
So the easiest way to begin is to sort of set a frame of reference. So how do chimpanzees differ from modern humans, us? First of all, most obviously, chimpanzees are principally quadrupedal animals. They spend a fair amount of time in the trees. When on the ground, they typically walk in a quadrupedal manner. And they spend a lot of time climbing and grasping for food and shelter, et cetera, in trees. This impacts their anatomy from head to toe. Their feet are designed for grasping. Their pelvis is designed to assist the muscles that propel an animal on the four limbs forward. And their hands have extremely long and powerful fingers for grasping and climbing. On top of the locomotor frame of a chimpanzee is a head, a skull, that houses a relatively small brain of about 350 or 360 cubic centimeters on average, and with a very large projecting prognathic snout that houses extremely large canine teeth. These are the teeth at the corners of our mouths, but which in chimpanzees are large and dagger-like. And they're especially large and dagger-like in male great apes, gorillas, chimps, and orangs, because those teeth, somewhat counterintuitively, are not used in any kind of dietary role, principally. They're mostly used in displays of aggression between males that compete for access to reproductively fertile females in a polygynous social system, which all great apes, except humans, share. So a postcranial skeleton adapted for quadrupedal walking on the ground and climbing in the trees, topped with a small brain head with a projecting snout and these large dagger-like canines. Humans are completely different in this respect. First of all, we're upright bipeds. We walk perpendicular to the ground. And at any given time, as we're moving, we're only standing on one leg at a time. And so our feet are designed to be planted flat on the ground. Our toes no longer have manipulatory abilities, unlike a great ape's toes. Our pelvis is designed for striding with two legs. And of course, once you get up above the head, or sorry, the locomotor skeleton, we have these gigantic brains that dominate our head anatomy and these flat, retruded faces with tiny teeth. So no matter where you look in the anatomy of a living great ape, exemplified here by a chimpanzee, or a modern human, you see tremendous differences. So what does the fossil record show in terms of the progression of forms over the last 5 or 6 million years as you move from an ape-like form to one that's more human? And no fossil exemplifies those changes better than, say, Lucy, which is a extremely well-known fossil found in Ethiopia by Donald Johanson back in the mid-1970s, which shows in a single skeleton that's about 40 or 50% complete, a locomotor skeleton that for all intents and purposes is designed like ours for moving on two legs in a terrestrial setting, excuse me, but with a brain in the skull on top of that skeleton that is still fairly small and ape-like, and with a fairly protruding face. And canine teeth, although they're certainly larger than ours, they're much smaller than those of even a chimpanzee. And more importantly, they've been refashioned to be part of the dental mechanism for chewing rather than for social display. And you can see that in the shape of the canine teeth, because unlike a chimpanzee's canines, which when males and females get older, those canine teeth stay sharp and pointed right through reproductive maturity. Whereas in humans, our canine teeth wear down flat like all the other teeth with advancing years. And that shows the functional difference between these teeth. So Lucy, on the one hand, shows a human-like adaptation to bipedal locomotion, two-legged locomotion on the ground. But on the other hand, her head still has a large number of primitive features in it, brain size and projecting face, that recall a great ape ancestry, a chimpanzee-like ancestry. So it's a form which, of course, Lucy represents a species, Australopithecus afarensis, as it's called, the technical term, that was unknown to Charles Darwin, as virtually, Darwin had no access to an African fossil record of human ancestry because it didn't exist in the 19th century. But Darwin would have been very pleased to see the Lucy skeleton because it fits his prediction of exactly what would appear in Africa in the fossil record, given an ancestry shared with African great apes.
That's an important note to bring up. Darwin had predicted exactly what Australopithecus afarensis turned out to be. He predicted a couple of transitions, Archaeopteryx being the first one that he predicted, and he got the satisfaction of knowing that one had been found just a couple of years after he wrote it. Right. But it was 100 years later before they found Australopithecus afarensis, and that would have been the one it would have been really proud of. The so-called missing link that people are still asking for today, even though it was found over 40 years ago.
Yeah, and let me just say a comment about missing link, because there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what a missing link means in an evolutionary context. To say that Lucy, for example, represents a missing link implies that there is a single chain of species and the evolutionary events recorded in those fossil species from a chimpanzee-like creature to modern humans, and that every fossil that you find establishes a link in that single chain. But we know that evolution, and Darwin understood this already in the middle of the 19th century. We know that the evolutionary tree of life is a bush with not just one stream of evolution, but thousands upon thousands of streams of evolution, each one leading to a living species. The human evolutionary tree, similarly, is not a single unbroken chain of events from a chimpanzee-like creature to a human. There are many side branches that have existed. One of the best known in our own later fossil record are the Neanderthals, which we know from a very good fossil record in Europe and Eurasia is a lineage that lived alongside creatures who were our own ancestors, meaning that there were parallel lineages. And this was the more or less common situation in the evolution of the human zoological family. And so
to throw out another clarification, when we were talking about the missing link that Darwin had predicted, he was specifically looking for something that was, in as far as character traits, intermediate in features and forms between the apes that were known in his day and modern humans.
right.
And Australopithecus afarensis fits that. But then if you're talking about the branching tree pattern, there's some people that think that we evolved from chimpanzees, and Jared Diamond is making a different point there than some people might be imagining. So when they're talking about a missing link, then they're thinking that the Australopithecus was the chimpanzee we evolved from. I would think that the better tree would be based the missing link in that case, if that's what they're envisioning, the split between what became chimpanzees and what eventually became people would be Sahelanthropus tecadensis. Would that
Chadensis?
Okay. Yeah. All right, so it's not like we have, when you say a chimpanzee-like creature, I'm sure there are people thinking, well, they never found that, did they? But in fact,
no, we do. We do have fossils that are very close to the time period when the molecular evidence, the DNA evidence, suggests that chimpanzees and humans last shared a common ancestor. But you made a very important point, which I want to reiterate. Darwin predicted structural intermediates, and Lucy is very much a structural intermediate between an African great ape like a chimpanzee and modern humans. But a structural intermediate is not the same thing as an evolutionary intermediate, in the sense that structural intermediates can be off on side branches, right? Neanderthals are in many ways structurally intermediate between earlier hominins and modern humans, but they're not our direct ancestors.
Let's get a little perspective here. So you were saying the last common ancestor of humans and great apes was over 6 million years ago. And now you're talking about Australopithecus afarensis, and that was under 4 million years ago. So we jumped ahead
Lucy's species lived between around 3 million and 3.6 or 3.7 million.
Okay. And before we leave the ancestor of great apes and us, there are some developments there too that became more what we have than the forms before them, like teeth development, like molars, right?
The molars that we have, so we have 3 molars, of course, in the adult dentition, and we share that with all primates. Monkeys, apes, lemurs all have 3 molars in each quadrant of the jaws, the upper left, right, lower left, right. There are 3 molars. and we share that characteristic with lots and lots of other animals, mammals, including all primates, where we have changed in the number of teeth we have in our mouth, and this is the big perspective I think you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in front of the molars, we have what are called the premolars. And your dentist calls the premolars bicuspids. When he goes and puts a filling in your first bicuspid, it's the first tooth in front of the molars, and they're called premolars. We have only 2 of those in each quadrant of the jaws. New World monkeys, like squirrel monkeys that live in South Central America, have 3. And so we and the great apes and the old world monkeys, baboons and so forth, have lost the front one. And that's a evolutionary novelty that unites baboons, great apes, and humans together. So the further you go back in time, the more primitive the dentition becomes. And the fewer the number of shared characteristics as we go back further in time, because of the evolutionary changes that have happened more recently.
Interesting. And there's more than that too, but I guess you actually studied and researched Australopithecus in Ethiopia.
Oh yeah.
What developments? I'm sorry. What discovery did you make?
Oh well, I've been working at the Lice site in one way or another since 1990, and. For example, one of the things that we did not have from the work that was done back there at the Hadar site, the Lice site, in the years around which Lucy was found, was a complete skull. So Lucy had enough of her skull to talk about the size of her brain, and we had the lower jaw, so we knew something about the projection of the face and the teeth, but. One of the things that was really lacking was a complete skull, and we finally found a complete skull of Lucy's species in the early 1990s, some 15 years after she was found, and it was the result of a lot of searching and a lot of hard work, and we now have 3 skulls of her species from the Hadar site where Lucy is from.
So it's not just remnants like teeth, like a lot of times creationists complain about that, but you have 3 complete skulls of Australopithecus.
I just happen to have a replica of one of them, which you can see right here. This was a skull. We think it's a female skull. It's a cast, it's a replica. The original is in Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
It was found in the year 2000. It is about 3.1 million years old, mm-hmm. and is about the same size as the remnants we have of Lucy's skull. And you can see.
What name does that one have?
What do you mean name?
Well,
I mean like Lucy.
Like Lucy, like what was the other one? Miss Dibbs or something like that. I can't remember
Mrs. Mrs.
Yes.
No, we didn't give this one a nickname.
Okay.
So it's known as the 822 skull because 822 is the number of the locality where it was found.
All right.
So we know it is the 822 skull, but you can see my left hand here is holding a rather projecting face.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and let me get a better grip on this here so I can show you the face. Whoop, you can see everything's a mirror image here. So you can see how projecting the face is. My hand fits around the brain case that holds the brain. In fact, we have an estimate of brain size of this individual of about 375 cubic centimeters, which is just about 20% larger than that of a chimpanzee.
So real quick, in summary, I mean, there are people that I frequently argue with who insist that the Australopiths were just chimpanzees.
They were not.
Right. Give me an explanation then, just what you showed us in the skull.
Well, I don't have other bones with me here because I'm at home, as most people are working from home these days, and most of my specimens are in the lab at ASU. But If they were, quote, just chimpanzees, Lucy's pelvis would look like that of a quadrupedal climbing animal rather than a bipedal human. Her foot would look like that of a grasping foot like that of a chimpanzee instead of an arched foot with an immobile first toe designed
Okay,
for.
so just to clarify again, you're not saying that Australopithecus has that pelvis. You're saying that if it was just a chimpanzee, then the pelvis would be different than it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I see the skull again?
I beg your pardon?
Can I see the skull again?
You may.
Thank you. Does it have like the ridge or sagittal crest like a chimpanzee?
No, this is a female, and females in Lucy's species don't.
Okay.
Very similar to what you see in female great apes. Typically, they have smaller chewing muscles.
Mm-hmm.
The chewing muscles are what is responsible for the development of the big ridge or sagittal crest on the top of many great ape skulls, especially in gorillas. and females tend to have much smaller chewing muscles and therefore lack the crest.
So a male Australopithecus would have a sagittal crest?
Many of them do.
Awesome.
Yeah,
And
I want to.
Yeah, there's one other thing. You were talking about in your lecture that Australopiths have reduced canines
Yes.
like us, but they're still bigger than ours.
Bigger than ours and smaller than that of a chimpanzee. And here's the, I'll get used to this. Here's the canine in this skull where my finger is right here. And if this were a chimpanzee, it would be twice that height, be twice as long than this.
You talk about paleoanthropology as well. So why do you think they have reduced canines? Because you're saying perhaps it was related to male threat displays. What was their competition for females different, and they didn't need the big canines, or what?
There are a couple of possible explanations for this. The one that seems to have the best support from the fossil evidence is that the reduction of the canines initially was not a dietary adaptation, but instead involved a change in the social system. And the reason we think this is true is because of a species even older than Afarensis, and this is a species called Ardipithecus ramidus, also from Ethiopia. And Ardi, the nickname for it, shows canines that, like those of Australopithecus, are reduced compared to those of chimpanzees and are refashioned in terms of their shape away from the long pointed dagger-like canines of great apes. But the rest of the teeth in the Ardipithecus mouth look remarkably like those of chimpanzees. They're very small. The chewing teeth are very small. And unlike later human teeth, the enamel that coats the inside, that covers the inside tissues of the tooth is very thin, like in chimpanzees. If diet was the key cause of canine reduction in earliest human evolution, then we would expect to see a change in those parts of the dentition that are involved in heavy chewing, high magnitude chewing forces for changes in diet. Then you reduce your canines to match the rest of the teeth. That's not the case with Ardi. Ardi has chimpanzee-like chewing teeth, but reduced canines. And that seems to indicate that the better explanation is that there was a change in social system. So if there was a change, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. We're comparing the canines to chimpanzees, which is a fair comparison because they're our closest cousins. Mm-hmm. But do bonobos also Are their teeth smaller than troglodytes? But they probably still have longer canines, right?
That's true. You've described it accurately. They are smaller than what is called the common chimpanzee or Pantroglodytes, because bonobos are smaller animals, so their teeth
Oh,
are
that's
smaller.
true. But they have different social behaviors as well.
They do, but there's still competition for females. The social behavior is different, but it's still a polygynous social system.
Mm-hmm.
It's still one male. It's still males competing for access to females. It's not identical to that of the other chimpanzee species, but it's a variant of it. And their canines are still sharp and pointed, but smaller because they're smaller animals.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any more questions here?
Oh, okay. Just a second. Okay.
I got one while she's looking for those. Professor, how many individuals have been found from Australopithecus afarensis and all of the other Australopiths?
Oh my gosh. Well, I can speak firsthand to afarensis. The others I don't have. It's not a count I have in my head. But for afarensis, Lucy's species, we have over 400 specimens. Lucy counts as one. I mean, she has, more than 100 bones to her skeleton, but we count her as one specimen, one cataloged specimen. So we have some 390 some in addition to her. None of them are as complete as she is. Some individuals are represented by a single tooth, others by parts of a skeleton, others by a skull, and a couple by partial skeletons. We have Lucy is one. We have another individual represented by parts of the skull, the lower jaw, and the arm of a single individual. So altogether, we have several hundred individuals represented by those 400 some specimens, just of her species. Now magnify that by several times to take into account all the other sites in Eastern Africa, from Ethiopia down through Kenya and Tanzania and so forth, and then in South Africa, where there are sites yielding Australopithecus fossils known since the 1920s and 30s.
Okay, I know where I was wanting to go. Let's talk about bipedalism. What environmental factors drove this? Was it more grasslands, and was it like this gradation, like a ring species of greater bipedalism in certain habitats, and where there's more trees, there's more arboreal species?
The first indications of bipedality on the ground actually come with Ardipithecus, the same species I just mentioned in terms of its teeth. And the anatomy of Ardipithecus, which by the way is also represented by a partial skeleton, like Lucy, even more complete than Lucy's, and at about 4.5 million years. That skeleton shows that in terms of the foot, the individual represented by this skeleton was still capable of chimpanzee-like grasping and climbing. It had a divergent first toe that was mobile, like that of an ape. But its pelvis shows unmistakable signs of a creature that was pushing off its lower limbs on two legs on the ground. Now, what's interesting about Ardipithecus is that it appears that its preferred habitat was relatively wooded, not open grasslands or plains. So given that, it appears that the first indications of a creature in our ancestry coming to the ground and spending time on two legs did not happen with the initial spread of open grasslands. That came later. By the time we get to Lucy, the ape-like grasping foot has been lost. And we know that Lucy's environment is more open than than that which Ardipithecus occupied. So while the first indications of bipedality on the ground didn't necessarily correlate with expanded open environments, later changes, for example, in the foot and elsewhere, that that correlate with a firmer commitment to terrestrial locomotion on two legs does appear to be associated with the spread of open environments.
You're muted, honey.
That's because the dog has started barking again. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your personal experience and also about the Institute for Human Origins.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned, I've been working in Ethiopia since 1990. I've been involved in this field since I was an undergraduate in Ohio. And I attended college at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland and eventually got my PhD at Kent State in Ohio. And so even as an I took a course from Donald Johanson as an undergraduate and became entranced with the idea of tracing our past through the fossil record. And so, I've been dedicated to this field since the early mid-1970s. I wound up working at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in the 1980s. And then in the 90s, I received an invitation from the Institute, which had been founded by Johanson in Berkeley, California, as a nonprofit entity. And I joined the Institute in 1985, just about the time I finished my PhD. And then we moved to Arizona State in 1997, affiliated with the university here in Tempe, Arizona. So I've been at this a very long period of time. I've worked, in addition to Ethiopia, I've worked in Tunisia, I've worked in Tanzania, I've done a little bit of field work in China. And also in later periods of time, I also have done work with colleagues in Israel on Neanderthals excavating caves in the northern part of Israel in the 1990s and early 2000s. So I've done quite a bit of field work, mostly in the early part of the record, but also in the Neanderthal part as well. And I've been director of the Institute at ASU since 2008. And actually, at the end of this coming summer, end of June 2021, I'll be stepping down as director and spending the last few years of my career, as I move eventually towards retirement, doing a little bit more thinking and writing than I have time to do now with all my administrative responsibilities running IHO.
Do you have books to point to already?
I've been I'm in of technical books, not books that are fit by consumption by mere mortals, unfortunately. But one of my goals is to write a book for popular consumption in the years leading up to my retirement and beyond, actually. So that's coming down the pike.
All right, very good. We've covered about a half hour, and I want my audience to understand that your lecture.
One other thing. We're working on a book too for popular consumption, and so your particular field is very relevant to what we want to do too. But that's not my question. The question is sexual dimorphism in Australopiths. Is this where humanity, where the origin of some of our sexually divergent between ourselves traits came from? And what were some of the traits, if there are, that were sexually dimorphic between Australopith males and females?
Well, let's talk about what sexual dimorphism is, first of all, for the audience that might not know the term. Sexual dimorphism refers to differences in anatomy, physiology, and behavior, separating males from females. We've already talked about one very prominent aspect of sexual dimorphism in the great apes, which are the canine teeth, which are much larger in males than in females and figure in how males compete with one another for access to reproductively active females. The canines are what one anthropologist once called the anatomy of bluff and fighting. And in polygynous social systems like those of great apes and baboons and so forth, the canines are a very prominent feature of the male anatomy because they're very visible signs of outward aggression. We obviously have lost those. But that's not the only sign of sexual dimorphism. There are other signs, for example, body size. So gorillas, for example, which have extreme body size dimorphism, that is body size differences between males and females, where males are often more than 2.5 times the size of females. Clearly, that's not the case in humans. There are average size differences between human males and human females, but they're much, much reduced in difference compared to what we see in, for example, gorillas. Some of the behavioral aspects of dimorphism, of course, don't fossilize. They have to be inferred from the fossil evidence itself. And there's nothing wrong with inference in science. Inference is a major part of all sciences, from physics to the social sciences. So we infer, for example, from the canine teeth, when we look at Lucy's species and see that the canine teeth are reduced, there's less of a difference between males and females, and they're refashioned in terms of their shape, so they no longer remain sharp and pointed in advanced adult ages, that there was a social difference in how males competed for females, or perhaps that they didn't compete at all. Of course, humans are in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways monogamous, whereas other great apes are not. And there is an idea that some of the early Australopiths with reduced canine dimorphism, reduced body size dimorphism, may actually have embarked on a route towards pair-bonded males and females fairly early on.
There are two other features that I can think of off the top of my head. One is just from looking at humans, being males are hairier than females sometimes. That's kind of a dimorphism. But that's not something we would be able to see in an Australopith fossil, right? And
well, of course. Aaron and I both have beards after a fashion, and you're not going to preserve a beard in the fossil record.
Right.
But hairiness, yes, there is a difference in the distribution of hair, density of hair in males and females today. Obviously, certain areas of hairiness are common to both of us. But facial hair is a prominent difference. And that no doubt relates to how males and females have communicated with one another through visual cues, because we are much more than any other animal visually oriented. We don't rely on olfaction so much. We rely on our eyes. And so the fact that males and females differ today principally in the distribution of facial hair is no doubt related to how males and females signal each other through social interaction.
Is it
there are so many other...
Is there preference for perhaps Neanderthal features, like the more baby-faced a female looks, the more a male selects them sexually?
No, I don't think there's any evidence for that. And neoteny, for your audience, is the retention of juvenile features in adult growth stages. Mm-hmm. And that was a popular idea at one point in human evolution some 30, 40 years ago, but it's really lost favor now because there's very little evidence for it.
Okay, and the other one was, from what I see in humans, that female humans retain more prominent mammary glands, even when they're not nursing.
Yes.
But we wouldn't be able to know something like that in Lucy, right?
No, there's no way to tell that for sure. Mm-hmm. We know that permanently enlarged breasts in human females, like like facial hair in males, may have actually given a bipedal animal where the face is front and the rest of the body is presented at the front.
Mm-hmm.
Permanently enlarged breasts in humans as compared to other apes, which don't have that. They're only enlarged when females are lactating. May also likewise be part of a social signaling mechanism, since as a biped, the entire body frame is presented, forward to other members of the social group.
On the hair thing, do we have reduced hair? Maybe not so much for sexual selection, but more so because of lice and pests.
Yeah, the most prominent explanation for the reduction of body hair ultimately involves the movement of human populations outside of the tropics and subtropics, where it wouldn't be an advantage any longer. And so yeah, because the loss of body hair in humans, of course, both affects males and females equally, and therefore it's not likely to be a character related to sexual selection.
Arn had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are so many other clues when you can't get direct observance of hair expression, or you get direct observance of behavior. When we do have chemical cues for the shift from C3 plants to C4 plants in the diet, or like the molecular clock division between the parasites of what we call head lice and what we call pubic lice, being that head lice are very closely related to chimpanzee lice, not surprising, but our pubic lice are very closely related to gorilla lice and show a 6 million year divergence, or excuse me, a 3 million years divergence, according to the molecular clock. And this would imply that Lucy, for example, would already have been in that stage where the head and the pubic area are already separated by
differentiating. Yep. That's a reasonable inference. Yeah.
So we talked about a little bit about your career and a little bit about the evidence. And I want my audience to understand that the lecture you gave was a full 2 hours of so many different species and so many different parts of them, the feet, the fingers, the shape of the teeth, the shape of all these different types of teeth, and for a number of different species. There was a lot of information that was covered in that, and we've just tried to shrink all of that into like 30 minutes so that we obviously can't cover the wealth and breadth of information that was in that lecture. But we did want to reserve a few minutes for the live chat.
Right. Let me just say before we move to that.
Yes.
That yes, we've only been able to cover the highlights, and mostly in the early part of the record. We haven't talked about the later part of the record. But the point is that since Darwin's time, when essentially there was no fossil record, I mean, there were just a few Neanderthal fossils in Europe when Darwin was alive, and that was it. So we have now a fossil record of some 15 or 20 species in the human evolutionary tree, represented by literally thousands of fossils from the earliest around the time of the human chimpanzee divergence. Sahelanthropus, you mentioned, Ardipithecus is another, through Australopithecus, early Homo, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, so forth and so on. The fossil record is uniform in conveying the message of change through time from a more primitive or ape-like creature in the earliest stages to a more human-like set of species in the latest stages, until the Neanderthals went extinct and we were the only one left standing. And that's where we are today. But the fossil record speaks eloquently about the evolutionary changes since the time we shared an ancestor with the chimpanzee.
Outstanding. Thank you very much for that. Hun, do we have any questions from the chat?
Okay, some. Let me scroll down.
And I want to tell everybody that we were trying to highlight some of the super chat suggestions, but we've known from past experience that it's not really conducive to read the chat at the moment that the chat appears, because very often it causes an interruption or a sidetrack, and then we don't cover the points that we need to get to. So thank you for your patience about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Eugene Sanderson asked, when did we transition to omnivores?
To an omnivore. I'm not sure there was an actual transition to omnivore. Chimpanzees are omnivorous. They don't eat a lot of meat, but they do hunt monkeys and small mammals, and so they eat meat. They're not as reliant on meat as we are, and the archaeological records suggest our ancestors may have been even more reliant on meat than we are today. But omnivory appears to be part of our ancestry, going back to the ancestry we shared with chimpanzees. If you move back to the gorilla is largely an herbivorous animal. Most eats vegetation, mostly, but that's in keeping with its very large size. Large mammals tend to eat bulky, non-nutritious foods. Small mammals tend to be more omnivorous, and the smallest mammals, insectivores, are relying 100% on meat protein in the form of insects. So our size, as well as our shared ancestry with chimpanzees, suggests that omnivory is deep in our heritage.
Something that surprised me and that I didn't know till relatively recently is a lot of animals you think are obligate vegetarians. Like they found deer eating human bodies recently. Like they're opportunistic meat eaters sometimes.
Yeah.
So you could see where it would fluctuate back and forth.
It's there's a myth that there's a myth that at a certain point in our ancestry we were vegetarians, and that speaks, and that fact speaks for being a vegetarian today, and it is a myth. There's no point in time in our ancestry that suggests that our ancestors were pure vegetarians.
Okay. The next question. Craig, are we close to bonobos as we are to chimpanzees? But I think they mean pan-troglodytes.
Yeah, well, bonobos and chimpanzees. That's a reason. Those are good names, common names for both.
Mm-hmm.
We are equally related to them because the bonobos and chimpanzees are more closely related to one another than either is to us. So therefore, we are equally related to bonobos and chimps.
Interesting. And I think a lot of people see like the social friendliness of bonobos and stuff like that, and they don't think of us as much as like the pan-troglodytes. But pan-troglodytes, I think they'll have wars between troops. Humans have wars.
They do, and there are certain aspects of bonobo behavior that look a little more human. There are certain aspects of chimpanzee behavior that look a little more human in terms of the aggression between social groups, etc. Mm-hmm. So you can't choose one or the other as the ideal prototype for a human ancestor shared with chimpanzees. It would be sort of a mix of the two. And that's right, because chimpanzees and bonobos are more closely related to one another, as I've said, than they are to us.
Exactly. The next question, Bruce Hobson, is there any means to study how communication may have led to larynx vocal cord location, an early evolutionary advantage?
Right. So, unfortunately, the base of the skull, where this soft tissue anatomy resides in us under here, doesn't preserve evidence of the arrangement of the larynx and vocal cords, etc. You can't read the anatomy of those soft tissues from the base of the skull, which is, of course, what we find in the fossil record. So most of the ideas about the change in the larynx and vocal cords is inferred from the comparison of other primates to humans, where you do see a huge difference in the arrangement of these tissues that relate to, number one, the change in poise of the head on an upright body frame once you achieve bipedality, and secondly, the attainment of speech. But that evidence isn't recorded very conclusively in the fossil record itself.
We got two more. Just pulling them up here. The next question Arn, uh, you didn't mention in your series, you talk about how wisdom teeth still exist, but but a shrinking jaw. You know, that kind of.
We still have wisdom teeth, our third molars, but I can imagine that a large number of your audience, it was certainly true for me, the wisdom teeth become impacted. I had all four of my wisdom teeth yanked at one time in my 20s. That was not a very pleasant experience, and it's due to the fact that there are different genes for the development of the teeth and different genes for the development of the jaw and its size. And sometimes when the jaw is reduced, as it has in human evolution, there's a mismatch between the size of the dentition, represented by the last molars, the wisdom teeth, and the size of the jaws. Were it not for dentists who and other dental professionals yanking our wisdom teeth out when they become impacted, one might imagine natural selection could act eventually to reduce the size of the wisdom teeth to avoid the complications of impaction, because you can get infected, and anytime you have a major infection up here, it can actually spread into other aspects of your head. It can be lethal. And anybody who's had problems with impacted teeth knows very well how it might impact your reproductive success. Reproduction is probably one of the last things on your mind when you're suffering from impacted wisdom teeth. But the fact that dentists pulled them out basically shields our dentition from the effects of natural selection, which would otherwise act to reduce them in a small jaw like ours.
Somebody in the chat is noticing that not everybody has impacted teeth.
Right.
With the reduction of the jaw, we have a smaller jaw than the gorillas do and chimpanzees do, but we still have the same number of teeth in there, and so they don't always fit. And
That's
so
right.
it's a very subtle difference as whether your jaw is big enough or not, and the angle that third molar comes in is not always in an angle that works. It may come in at a slightly different angle, which forces that molar up against something else. And then there's studies now of a PAX9 that
Right.
I forget what the way to. Maybe you should do that one. Explain what the PAX9 is.
It's a gene. Well, I'm not sure what you're trying to say. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there's a number of people that have expressed this gene that causes the anagenesis, or the lack of development of that third molar. Right. It doesn't happen. Yeah. And so when people have this mutation, of course, they never have impacted wisdom teeth. Right. And so they don't have that problem. And so that's one of the things that they were looking at, is like, wouldn't it be nice if we could engineer genetically everybody to have this mutation? Then we wouldn't have the whole industry of impacted wisdom teeth would be negated.
Well, and then there'd be a whole profession that would be negated too.
Well, the dentists have plenty of other stuff to do.
Before we leave the smaller jaw, isn't that an important development for the size of a larger brain case? That like those two things are related, aren't they, from an evolutionary standpoint?
Oh, I think you're talking about a different mutation that reduced the size and girth of the jaw muscles, which also reduced the need for the sagittal crest, which was enveloping a very small brain case. And when that mutation to reduce those jaw muscles happened, it enabled the room for encephalization, for the brain to get really big.
Yeah, that was a paper that came out a few years ago, which invoked a single mutation to explain all of what you just described. And there was a lot of debate about this, because single genes in evolution, insofar as they impact anatomy, they're not very common. Most of the anatomical traits we have are caused by many genes acting together, interacting. And the idea that a single mutation would both explain the reduction of jaw muscles and at the same time permit the expansion of the brain seems a bit far-fetched to me.
Well, in fairness, the story I was reading was, the paper I was reading was coupling that with a dysfunction of a tumor suppressor gene, which was supposed to regulate brain size to regulate tumors. And the result of that was that we are more prone to brain cancer, but the brain grows essentially, out of the original control bounds.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that.
Okay, go ahead.
Do we have any more from the super chat?
Yeah, not super chats. I haven't kept track of those because I was asking questions and stuff. But there are some questions.
I see somebody's asking about Neanderthals.
Okay, we'll do that one. There's two. What Neanderthal characteristics remain in modern humans that have an effect on us?
Well, Neanderthals had brains sizes that were at least as large as ours. And Neanderthals are a cousin lineage to us. And that means that both Neanderthals and our direct ancestors in Homo sapiens probably inherited the large the large brains from an ancestor they shared. And there's a species in the fossil record called Homo heidelbergensis, which begins at around 500,000 years or 400,000 years and runs to about 200,000 years. And that species appears to have figured in the ancestry both of Neanderthals and us. And both Neanderthals and our lineage inherited those large brains, which we now have, from that common ancestor. There are other traces in the ancient DNA of genes that appeared in the Neanderthal genome that appear to have been transferred into ours as the result of interbreeding between the two lineages, which we know happened from the analysis of ancient DNA. Many humans, the majority of humans, have somewhere around 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA in our genomes, mostly non-Africans, because Neanderthals were not their distribution didn't include Neanderthal. They were an exclusively European and Eurasian fossil group. And so when our direct ancestors came out of Africa at about 80 or 70,000 years ago, there were episodes of interbreeding between these populations when they interacted. And so some Neanderthal genes did wind up in the modern human genome, and some of them appear to have been related to living in non-tropical environments, temperate environments in the northern latitudes, which human ancestors were encountering for the first time as they left Africa.
Could that be where we got our red hair gene, or?
Well, exactly. Yeah. There's talk that the genes for red hair originated in Neanderthals. We do see some of that in the Neanderthal genome, and also about general hair distribution.
I think that's interesting because a lot of times when you hear about traits that are genetic traits that are from the interbreeding of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, they are diseases, genetic diseases, and they aren't something like functional, like a hair distribution.
Yeah, there's another great example of this, not involving Neanderthals. So some of your viewers will know that there's a group that is most well known from its DNA in Asia called the Denisovans. And the amount of fossil bones that are attributed to the Denisovans you could fit on a small table in front of you. I mean, they're very, very few. But those bones that exist have yielded an amazing trove of ancient DNA. And a colleague of mine in IHO, the institute here at ASU, was part of a team that published a paper just a couple of weeks ago showing that the Denisovan genome in Central Asia, this is in Mongolia on the Tibetan plateau, that the Denisovans of Central Asia actually had genes that for high altitude adaptation. So high altitude, of course, you're dealing with an oxygen poor environment, and your blood system needs to be able to adapt to a very oxygen poor environment in order to survive. The Denisovan genome actually has the genes that enable those physiological processes to occur in high altitude. And it is thought that modern human populations moving into Central Asia from the West encountered Denisovans, interbred with Denisovans, and the genes that that assist in the physiological processes of high altitude adaptation were actually passed to the modern human genome through those events, and enable people to live in high altitudes today in Tibet and elsewhere.
That's another fascinating thing about the confluence of physical and molecular evidence.
That's
We
right.
find that there is Neanderthal DNA in all human migration out of Africa. So people who had always lived in Africa did not interact with the Neanderthals. They don't have any Neanderthal DNA. But then as the human migration went into the Middle East and then headed east from there, as you mentioned, they run into people in Eastern Asia and down into Southern Asia and Indonesia, where we're finding traces from Tibet through Polynesia of interactions with Denisovans. So that there was and obviously this didn't happen with Western Europe or so on, but we're finding this genome present in living people where there was this interaction. It grazed the line about what we can call a different species as opposed to, say, a different subspecies or what have you. It was clearly on the way there, and I think that there was less admixture events with Neanderthals than there were certainly with Denisovans, because they're just, that whole area of Southeast Asia seems to have quite a lot.
Yeah. So Southeast Asian populations today have a higher concentration of Denisovan genes than any other population living today. And that is testimony to the fact that the Denisovans must have been very widespread at one point across Asia.
And yet we didn't know anything about this entire collection of people.
We know
almost a single thing.
We
like
know
a single
almost,
finger bone.
Right. They're finger bones. There are now some teeth and a few other things showing up in caves in Central and Eastern Asia, including Siberia, what is today Siberia. And so we know that, from their DNA, well, first of all, we know from the Denisovan DNA that they're closely related to Neanderthals. They shared an ancestor with Neanderthals, separate from the one that they both shared with us, right? And so there are episodes of interbreeding between Denisovans and Neanderthals, between Denisovans and humans, modern humans, our ancestors, direct ancestors, and of course, as you know, Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern humans. So there you have these three branches on the tree with interbreeding among all three of them at different periods of time.
What time would the Denisovans interacted with Homo sapiens? What period?
Oh, that would have been 60, 70,000 years ago, which is the time that modern humans began to spread across the southern part of Asia, and then eventually into Central Asia. So, we know that modern human ancestors, based on their skeletal remains, got into what we today call the Middle East by about 110,000 years ago, but they didn't get any further than that at that time. And it wasn't until about 60 or 70,000 years ago that they began to spread beyond that part and they spread initially to the east across the southern tier of Asia. And eventually they wound up in Australia. We have evidence of human.
That was my next question. Were there Denisovans on the Pacific Islands in Australia?
Well, we have evidence of humans, fossil evidence of humans moving into Australia by about 50,000 years ago.
Did they?
Whether the Denisovans actually got that far, we don't know. We don't have
that. That would mean that they were making boats and tool use and stuff.
Well, yes, it would. There are areas of habitation in island Southeast Asia that would have had to have been reached by some kind of seafaring. Now, seafaring does not necessarily imply a boat. Mm-hmm. If you've ever spent time at sea, you know that there are sometimes these vast rafts of sea vegetation. Mm-hmm. that float from place to place, and animals alight on them, birds and other forms of animals
Driftwood?
can alight on these things and be moved quite some distance.
Like driftwood?
Kind of like driftwood, but more they're vast mats of vegetation, and this is one means by which animal and plant life is moved from one place to the other in the ocean.
One of the leading hypotheses, I believe, for the migration to Hawaii was that an entire village is on a mat of woven together grasses and such, where they bring a group of people. I mean, like the whole village of people, and also their animals, and also the like barrels of plants and everything. And who knows how long they've been on this mat, and that a lot of the Polynesian areas had been basically by raft this way, because it's the only way that you could have a sustainable population arrive there. And if they made it as far away from absolutely everything else as Hawaii, then that tells you how many different groups of people never made it.
Right. That's true. And the same is true with the Galapagos Islands of Darwin fame. This is 600 miles off the South American coast, and yet they were populated even before humans got to the Galapagos. They were populated by birds and insects and plants carried by birds in the form of seeds, etc. Hundreds of miles off, out into the ocean. So these kinds of things happen all the time.
So it comes to an interesting choice. Hey, do you want to get on this big raft and maybe never get anywhere except a terrifying death? Or, you know what? I kind of like this village. I'm going to stay here. All right. So do we have any more questions, dear?
Yeah, there's just maybe one more.
Maybe one more. All right. Thank you.
Eugene Sanderson, there are isolated tribes on islands that haven't come into contact with modern humans. I wonder what the genetic makeup of these guys are. Probably.
Well, go ahead.
They're probably still Homo sapiens.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are modern humans.
Yeah.
They share the same ability to reproduce with us as any other modern human population does. Their isolation may be reflected in some genetic divergences underlying that isolation for some period of time, but that doesn't mean that they're not modern humans. And the modern human species is defined not by genetic similarity or difference, but is instead defined by the ability of individuals from different populations spread across the globe to successfully interbreed with one another. And, there's no evidence that any population that we would recognize today as, quote, modern human fails to be able to interbreed with any other. And certainly the suggestion of colonialization and warfare across the globe, through human history is eloquent testimony to the fact that basically humans will successfully interbreed no matter where they go and what they do.
I don't remember the name, but wasn't there another species of humans that was smaller?
Homo floresiensis in Indonesia.
Yeah, that's a form that lived about 60,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, made it to a remote island in Southeast Asia called Flores. Mm-hmm. And the important part of that event, and this is related to the discussion we were just having about, how human populations spread around the globe, they would have required some seafaring skill to get out there, because the island of Flores, during the rise and drop of sea levels during glacial and interglacial times of the Pleistocene, Flores was never connected to the Southeast Asian mainland, unlike, say, the Philippines or Indonesia, Java, and so forth, which at various times were connected to the Southeast Asian mainland during glacial periods when sea levels dropped. Flores, where these small populations of human relatives wound up, was always isolated by water.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
which is really surprising because I mean the one example we have for Floresiensis that gives a brain capacity implies that it doesn't even match the stone tools found with it. I mean, how could these people have such a small brain, despite the fact that they are small overall, and
Right.
still be able to make these tools and still be able to manage seafaring to get there in the first place?
Right.
It presents a mystery about how such a small human mind can work.
Well, and the answer to that question partly depends on the answer to the question: did the Flores hominins evolve from small-brained ancestors, or did they evolve from ancestors that had larger brains? And the brains got small in these populations isolated on this island. We know that there are examples in the evolutionary record of what is called island dwarfing, which is when certain mammalian populations, large-bodied mammals, become isolated on islands because resources tend to be depleted there. They tend to evolve smaller body sizes, which energetically speaking are more efficient. More efficient to be a small-bodied creature than a very large-bodied one. Just look at how inefficient a cow is compared to a smaller mammal. And so the thought is that if Homo floresiensis evolved from a large-brained ancestor on the Southeast Asian mainland, like Homo erectus, right, and then got its smaller brain and body size once being isolated on this island, it could very well be that the learned technology, in terms of the stone tools, was already sufficiently integrated into the behavioral repertoire that even though the brains grew smaller, they didn't lose the skill to make stone tools, because that skill had been learned in their ancestors when the brains were larger. Now, if, on the other hand, the Flores hominins evolved from a small-brained ancestor, like an ancestor with the brain size of Lucy, right? Then you've got a real puzzle, because then you have to say, how did a fairly sophisticated stone tool technology evolve in a creature with the brain size of Lucy, when those hominins are not known to have made sophisticated stone tools in Africa 3 million years ago? Then it's a puzzle. So the puzzle is either daunting or not, depending on how you reconstruct the ancestry of the Flores hominins.
Well, anybody who appreciates a good mystery should appreciate paleoanthropology.
Oh yeah, it keeps us busy.
There's the size of the brain, but there's also structure. Like on average, perhaps females have smaller skulls than males, but there isn't really a difference in intelligence.
Correct.
Yeah. But this last question, because somebody did a super chat. Shigawire says, what changes happened behaviorally, technologically, culturally with the humans who crossed Beringia to America when they became the Clovis culture? Is that too far ahead in time for you?
Well, the Clovis culture is no longer it was once thought that the Clovis people were the earliest group, and now we know that they only went back I think 11,000 years, and now there's traces of people in the in North and South America going back 20,000 or more.
Yeah, and the older you get in that record, and this is not my area of expertise, but I know enough to be able to say that older than about 15 or 20,000, the evidence for human habitation in the so-called New World is very sketchy. So let's say it was no older than 15 to 20, just as a starting point for discussion. In order to have made it from Asia across Beringia into the Western Hemisphere, these populations would have had to have been fairly sophisticated big game hunters, and is probably the case that they made that crossing as part of migratory movements to follow large game on a seasonal basis. And once they made it into the New World, they were fully equipped already to handle the relatively, first of all, the height of the last glaciation in the Pleistocene was around 10,000 or 12,000 years ago. So they would have already been well adapted to that kind of environment, having crossed Beringia in the first place. So it doesn't appear that there are any major biological changes in the populations that first came into the Americas. Most of the changes would then have occurred on a cultural basis once those populations began to spread out into what was previously uninhabited territory by humans, and then evolved local traditions in how to make a living. Hunter-gatherers, more sedentary people, eventually more agriculturalists, etc., depending on what environments they found themselves in. But they entered the Americas as fully fledged, aggressive big game hunters, or they would not have been able to make the trip across.
Okay, and then there's different ways that they could have come over, and different things that they could have been hunting along the way, and they could have. Again, the mysteries to be solved by paleoanthropology. Professor Kimbel,
it keeps us busy.
I very, very much appreciate your being on.
My pleasure.
I'm enjoying the show more and more as getting to talk to professional scientists about what they do and everything. It's nice when I know something about it, but so that I can follow along. And I think that my job in this really is to try to translate some things to an audience that may not be, as you pointed out a couple of times, that other people are not going to know these terms. I should be more aware of that.
Well, one of the things we try to navigate, obviously human origin science has a broad public appeal, and people buy the books, they look at the YouTube videos, they do podcasts, and they keep an eye on the headlines for major discoveries. Those of us who do this work have a responsibility to, the best of our ability, translate the meaning of our discoveries and research results so that the broad public, the general public, can understand them and appreciate why what we do is, number one, is science, and number two, is an important science to understand for any responsible member of society.
There's a lot of mistrust of human origin science as well, and I think the better that people understand it, because of the work of scientists like yourself, then the less stigmatizing it'll be.
Well, as we know, very recent political history is not just human origin science that generates a lot of skepticism. Science as a whole in our country faces a big challenge with regard to the skepticism, especially as expressed by some of our political leaders. So.
Yeah, some of our earliest episodes of this very series dealt mostly with climate science.
Yeah, well, I can imagine that was a hot topic.
Yes, very much.
All right, well, my pleasure to join you today. I wish you best of luck with your show ongoing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
Are you going to end it, Aaron?
I'm waiting for our producer to end it.
I hear a sound of abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of shouting and singing. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of an abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. The Lord says it is done. The Lord says it is done. The Lord says it is done. For I hear victory, 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 victory in the corners of heaven. In the corners of heaven. Released right now. Angels are being dispatched right now. For angels will even dispatched from Africa right now. Africa right now. Africa right now. From Africa right now. They're coming here. They're coming here. In the name of Jesus. South America. They're coming here. They're coming here. They're coming here. They're coming here. From Africa. From South America. Angelic forces.